Should turn that off.
You can turn that off, I think. Hey, good morning. We're going to wait for a few people to get on and kind of go forward with what we got going today.
Good morning, everyone. It's Shabbat Shalom. It's Dave and Patty here again. We got something really exciting for you today. We're going to have James Tabor's lecture on who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls. This is a topic that has always fascinated me, and I hope you all are interested in it too. We're also going to be following up with a live discussion like we have been. Just to mention a couple other things, Ross will be coming back on next week with his series on Jeremiah, and we're also going to be posting some information later on how you can sign up for James Tabor's up-and-coming tour to the Holy Land. But stay tuned, and for that, but first, we're going to show this exciting video.
Yeah, we're going to wait a few minutes to let some people get on and so they can understand what's going on. What happened was Ross was going to be going live this morning from his from Jordan.
Right.
I'm not sure where, but the internet connection wasn't good enough. So we decided to do a few other things and kind of show something on the Dead Sea Scrolls versus the Bible. Dr. Tabor had a great talk with over 500,000 views. And so we're going to show that, but we're also going to talk about some other things. So now that it's 11:31, I'm going to go and kind of just go through a few things we got going on here. So the return to normalcy, as Patty said, next week, Ross will be back from the Holy Land, and it'll be the Saturday after Thanksgiving. So we're going to do a lecture that Dr. Tabor did on the Dead Sea Scrolls and comparing that to the current accepted Hebrew canon. And he's had over 500,000 views. And then we're going to go over a brief history of Dr. Tabor's tour. But I want to also remind everyone, the 80th annual conference is going to be happening in Charlotte this year or next year, the 21st through the 23rd of April. We're going to get the registration up soon. We really hope that we could get, this is the 80th. We hope we could get a huge effort, a huge, great things.
It's going to be huge.
It's going to be huge, Batman.
We hope to see you all there.
Yeah. And then, so we're going to talk a little bit about Dr. Tabor's tour. I don't know of anyone that could lead a tour in Israel for those of us and where we came from is as good as Dr. Tabor. He's really quite phenomenal at these things, and he's been there so many times, over 70 times, and led so many tours and archaeological digs and studies. He really does cover all those things, and we're really happy.
And he's going to take you to non-traditional sites. These aren't in the normal tours that are out there today by most organizations. These are kind of behind-the-scenes places and really cool sites that you're going to see if you go on this tour. So we'll post some information on how to register after the video.
Right. This will come up again, but here's the registration. It's on blossomingrose.org, and his tour is called Walking the Ancient Paths 2023. So that's something that you can do. It is an incredible tour. Everything is described there. And that's a really interesting thing that you should look at. Also, if you go to jamestabor.com, you'll see all the stuff he's up to. And he has a YouTube channel as well that are related to, but not part of United Israel, just like Ross has his own pages and stuff, because we explore things that are not under the umbrella of United Israel. I'm going to now show you I don't know if you've all seen Dr. Tabor's trailer that was done in anime or an animation, but we're going to play that right now. So we're going to do that, okay? Okay.
I love that Indiana Jones theme. What do you guys
Yeah,
think?
I
That was
think
pretty
the
cool.
hat looks good too. Actually, I think to be honest, I think whoever made that character blended me and James and Ross
And
and,
Ross
parts
together.
of all of us together
I think so.
because of how that looks. Anyways, this video that we're going to play now is extremely good, and I hope that you enjoy it. So the idea of canon is something that we all talk about, and many people have talked about. And what is the canon of the Bible you use? This is extremely a hot topic, because what do you include in what do you include in it? What don't you include in it? And then of course forget about the whole idea of translation, which there's this kind of biased translation to get the Bible to say what you believe it should say versus what it did say. And as we've talked a lot about in these studies, the Bible is some very difficult things that it presents to us. And so we can make a nice translation, make us all feel good, but what does it really say? So that's something that is evident there. The other thing is that we had a marker in time, right about 250 BC, of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they weren't looked at till 1948. And so that is it is a amazing thing to kind of have that comparison, because no one touched it in between, and that gives us, like if we use the Masoretic text, if that gives us a whole different view of what's there. So I think James did a great job of talking about this, because he has studied the Dead Sea Scrolls, and not only that, he knows, and he's introduced us to some of the greatest Dead Sea Scrolls scholars that were there when they were found and when they were first interpreted.
And
So,
one thing I'd like to say is
yeah.
that James, he did make this video in 2009. He posted it in March of this year and said that he really wouldn't change anything from what he had recorded. And so
I'm not sure this is that one.
Oh, it's
I'm
not
sorry.
that
No,
one.
no, but this is the one where he got over 550,000 views.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay,
so,
even better then.
Yeah,
Okay.
so we're gonna back out and just play this video. Then afterwards, we'll talk in the chat. We can talk in the chat while it's going on, and we'll have kind of a discussion about how does this impact our study and our faith. All right, I'm
going to get started here. Hope everybody can see and hear okay. So today I'm going to talk to you about the Dead Sea Scrolls Bible. And I'm using Bible in scare quotes because obviously nobody was carrying around the Dead Sea, a printed Bible or even a handwritten Bible. But the books that are part of the Hebrew Bible, they are represented in the Dead Sea Scroll Library to some extent, and that's what I want to talk about. Just as I start, I want to introduce you to some resources because I'm teaching a course this semester on the Dead Sea Scrolls, so I have everything right here. And I know many of you are very interested. I would say the number one book that I would recommend, I got to figure out how to show this at the right angle without the glare, but it's Vanderkam and Flint. I think you all can see that. The Meaning of the Dead Sea Scrolls. You can get it in paperback. Highly recommend it. This is the book on the scrolls. You really need it to be able to talk much about the scrolls or all of their background, and to know the history and what they contain and who wrote them and how to date them and all the theories, all the interpretations. That book is a book that I always use and with all of my students. And as far as reading the scrolls, which is also important, I always tell this story in the 90s when I was lecturing here in Charlotte, North Carolina, when the scrolls were on exhibit here in Charlotte, and there was this huge exhibit, and we had a lecture at the Jewish Community Center. It was standing room only. It was unbelievable. They had to get chairs and open up the side. Everybody's interested in the scrolls. And they had just been released through Robert Eisenman's efforts and Herschel Shanks at Bar Magazine and others. I was somewhat involved in that. And after my lecture, a woman came up and she said, "Oh, Dr. Tabor, I'm so glad we have the scrolls finally," because about probably a third of the scrolls had not been released until the 90s. So there was a big campaign, some of you will remember. Herschel Shanks really spearheaded it in Bar Magazine, but Robert Eisenman, I think, was really behind the scenes. And he's the one who actually got the photographs and then had them published. And then they were all public finally. So this is the complete Dead Sea Scrolls in English. It's a Penguin paperback. The editor is Geza Vermes, Vermes. I guess his name's not even on the front, but it's on the side, I think. Not even the side. So he didn't write them. He doesn't want his name on, but he's the translator, and it's a great edition. It has over 100 pages of introductory material, and then it also has lots of commentary and helps as you read the scrolls. But the main thing is it has the scrolls in English. So I really want to recommend this. So this woman was saying, "Oh, I love the scrolls." And I had a version of an earlier version of this. And I said, "Oh, have you read them yet?" And she goes, "Oh, no, I haven't read them, but I just love that we have them." So I think a lot of people are in that situation where we talk about, "Oh, finally we got the scrolls," but then you don't even read them. Maybe kind of like the Bible, with people who love that we have the Bible, but they've never read it. Then I want to mention, this is the year of the scrolls, because here's Life magazine, the Dead Sea Scrolls after 75 years. The Race to Solve an Ancient Mystery. You can get this at newsstands, grocery stores, and so forth. I ordered it from Amazon. And then this one is very nice. This is the Dead Sea Scrolls. The subtitle is 75 Years Since Their Historic Discovery. Both of these are worth having, but I would want the Vanderkam and Flint, the book. Most of the people listening to me in this audience, I think, are really good students, and they like to study. Now, that's in English. If you study Hebrew, which I know some of you do, you want to get it. It'll have a different cover. This is an edition I've had for several years. I think it's red now. Anyway, it's called the Dead Sea Scrolls Study Edition. Be careful if you order it, because there's a study edition that is just English. But as you see when I open this up, get a nice page of Hebrew here to show you. You can see you've got the English on one side and the Hebrew on the other. This is Martinez, the editor. Florentino Martinez. He's a good friend of mine. I see him at conferences. He works in Spain, in Madrid, I think, or maybe Barcelona. Yeah, I think Barcelona. But he's provided this wonderful study edition for students who want to read the Dead Sea Scrolls with Hebrew as well. Let me also mention, that's introductory, that I've recently put on my YouTube channel, which is, let's see, James Tabor Videos. You can find it on YouTube. I've been putting up a lot of things. I put up some things even this morning, but I've got 3 recent lectures that I did at the Biblical Archaeology Seminar over the years. One is called, let's see, I wrote this down, the exact names. Who Wrote the Scrolls? So you can look at that. Dead Messiahs Who Don't Return. And I did intend that title to be kind of shocking or provocative, but at the end I say, you know, one thing about all messiahs, they've all died and they haven't come back yet. And I was mainly talking about the teacher of righteousness, who's the leader of the Dead Sea Scroll community. And then a third video, the Dead Sea Scroll calendar. You know, there's several Jewish calendars that are being used in the time of the Second Temple period. For Christians, the time of Jesus. There are 3 different main calendars: a lunar calendar, a solar lunar calendar, a solar calendar, and then it has to do with how you calculate the months and so forth. And I've got those up. And if you go to my blog, jamestabor.com, I upload some documents. Here's a sample. These are printed documents that you can look at
that go with the videos. So that's enough for education. The only other thing I would mention is the Wikipedia article. I know professors are not supposed to recommend Wikipedia to their students, but you know what? Some of the Wikipedia articles are just excellent. If you want to go into some controversial thing or political thing, they can be tough. And I know religion can be controversial, but something like the Dead Sea Scrolls, the videos are, the articles in Wikipedia are fabulous. They really are. Very, very complete article. So that would be a good thing to read too. You could print it out and study it if you don't know much about the Dead Sea Scrolls. So I hope this lecture or lesson or class, I guess I could call it, would encourage you to delve into the Dead Sea Scrolls themselves. They certainly are the greatest archaeological discovery in our time. And I want to mention one other book. I think I have it here somewhere. Let's see. I thought I laid it down. I was going to show Ross's book. Yeah, I got it. Because this is about a Dead Sea Scroll as well. The question is, was it a forgery or was it authentic or a genuine scroll? And then when would it date? So if you haven't heard about this, it was featured the other night on Coast to Coast. It's really getting out there, and Ross has got a whole slate of interviews set up as a result of this book. So you should, most of you, I think many of you in this audience have heard of this, but in the back, there's a translation of what might be maybe the oldest and most important of all the Dead Sea Scrolls. We haven't been able to find it because it's disappeared, but Ross does a good transcription and translation of it. And I want to include that as well as part of the Dead Sea Scrolls. To read more about that, just go to themosesscroll.com, which is Ross's website. You can order the book through several means, including Amazon. Amazon, I think, is the publisher of it, or not the publisher, but the vehicle through which it was published. And also a blog where Nichols has put up a whole lot of entries about the scroll and everything about it. And in the last issue of Bar Magazine, I wrote an article with Idan Dershowitz, who's also working with us on the Moses Scroll, arguing that it is very likely authentic, that it's an authentic Dead Sea Scroll. But that's not what I'm talking about today. So all of that is preliminary. So what are the Dead Sea Scrolls? We've got 15,000 manuscripts or fragments of manuscripts. That's huge, representing probably 600 different works or books. And yet some of the books that are represented might just have a teeny piece or two that you could fit on just one page, just a fragment. And some of the fragments are the size of like a matchbook cover or even a thumbnail with only a couple of letters. So when we say 15,000 fragments, don't get too excited like you're going to have complete copies of things. However, there are some complete copies of some of the scrolls. They were mostly found in Cave 1 and then Cave 11 and then the Copper Scroll in Cave 3. And Cave 1 was just a treasure because you had something called the Community Rule, which is the charter of the group that wrote the scrolls or wrote the sectarian scrolls. I'll explain that in a minute as to what these 600 books are. Books that they wrote about their own group and their own movement, kind of like the Christians have the New Testament as their writings. So the Dead Sea Scroll group had their own writings. And another one is the Thanksgiving hymns, some of which were written by the teacher, their leader, we think. Like he uses the first person. We think he actually wrote these. So we've got that from Cave 1. You've got as well the War Scroll from Cave 1 and a number of other scrolls that are very complete. So if you break down the scrolls, about 30% of them are written by the group. We call them the sectarian scrolls. These are the scrolls where the group is talking about how they were formed and what they're all about and what their vision of things is and what their history is and so forth. So that's like almost a third are written by the group. And those are the ones I specialize in. And then there's another 30% that are copies of texts that they didn't write, but texts that are not the Hebrew Bible, but books that you would recognize the names of even if you haven't read them, like Jubilees, the Book of Jubilees. They love the Book of Jubilees. It fits their solar calendar that they used. And Enoch, not all of Enoch, because Enoch is in Ethiopic, the complete thing that we now have. But they had, of the 5 parts of Enoch, they had 4 of them, and they did use them. And in fact, some of the Aramaic Enoch texts are the oldest copies of Enoch that we have. And Enoch is quoted in the New Testament in the book of Jude. And there are a lot of other references in the New Testament, just allusions to some of the language of the book of Enoch. So people in the Second Temple period from, let's say, about the Maccabees down through Bar Kokhba, or down through the destruction of Jerusalem and on to Bar Kokhba, 1st century CE, they're making use of these books and using them all during that period. And then what we want to do today, 40% of the Dead Sea Scrolls are copies of books of the Hebrew Bible. So I want to introduce you to a book if you don't know it. I highly, highly recommend this book. It's I'm going to read you the blurb on it in just a minute, but I want you to be able to see it or get a screenshot of it. The Dead Sea Scrolls Bible, the oldest known Bible translated for the first time into English, and the authors are Abegg, Flint, and Ulrich, and it's really an amazing production. So what is this? Of those 40% of the Dead Sea Scrolls, of the 1,500 fragments, 600 volumes, the ones that are copies of the Bible are in this book. So you actually have the Dead Sea Scroll Bible. What it says at the top, over 1,000 years older than any previously discovered biblical manuscripts, with material never before published or translated, including hundreds of new and different readings and several lost psalms that actually could conceivably go into the book of Psalms. There's a Psalm 151, for example, that the Oxford Annotated RSV actually includes, as well as the new Oxford RSV. So, highly recommend this book, because this is what I'm going to talk from today. So who wrote the scrolls? Just before we start, who is this group, so that we know something about them? I could give a complete lecture on that, and I did. I mentioned I have a lecture on YouTube, and you can find it on YouTube and listen to it with a lot of supplementary material on my blog that goes with it. But usually people say, oh, the Essenes wrote the scrolls. The Dead Sea Scroll group are the Essenes. Well, obviously they didn't write all the scrolls, because you've got books like Jubilees and Enoch that they didn't write, and you've got the Hebrew Bible, which they didn't write. But that 30% is written by the group, and some of those even by the teacher himself. And so we could talk about scrolls that they wrote and who they were. I don't think the word Essene is very helpful. I think the group that wrote the scrolls is described by Josephus as the Essenes. So if you go to Book 2 of the Jewish War, you can read his long description of the Essenes. And he's very positive about them. But remember, he's writing for the Emperor Vespasian. He's living in Rome. It's around 75 CE, after the destruction of Jerusalem. And he wants to talk about the traditions of the Jewish people and the schools, philosophical schools is the way he describes them, Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes. And so he presents them in Hellenistic garb. And also he presents them in ways that the emperor would not find objectionable. Now that we have the scrolls, you can call them Essenes if you want, but don't go to Josephus for your definition of Essenes, because he makes them kind of quietists and pacifists, and they're a secluded group. They sound a lot like the Pythagoreans. And then, of course, he makes the Pharisees sound like Epicureans, and he makes, the Sadducees, and then the Pharisees he would describe in ways that would remind you of the Platonists, or particularly the Stoics, probably. So you see what he's doing. So to understand the Dead Sea Scroll group, again, it's better to read their own self-description. And what we come up with, if you read the Dead Sea Scrolls, the books that they wrote, I would describe them like this. You ready? An apocalyptic, messianic, new covenant group, baptizing. You have to be baptized, and it's a mikvah, it's Jewish mikvah, but probably in a running stream like the Jordan River or the Dead Sea. You could presumably be baptized in the Dead Sea because you probably want to hold your eyes really tight when you go under, but you could do that, and maybe they did baptize in the Dead Sea. So apocalyptic, messianic, new covenant. They claimed that they were the people of the new covenant. God has established the new covenant, and they were the ones. Separatist, communal living, and preparing the way in the desert. The Arava, Isaiah 40, verse 3. Just as the New Testament opens in the Gospel of Mark with John the Baptizer out in the desert, along the Jordan Valley, preaching and baptizing people, and people say, "Who are you?" And he says, "I'm the voice of one calling in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord." So when I say they're people of the way, that might remind you of something in the book of Acts, the New Testament book of Acts, because they also pick up this same language. So people of the way means people of the desert way, people that are following the Torah according to the interpretations of this group, and what we call halakha, interpretations of Torah. So whether you call them Essenes or not, basically go to the scrolls for a definition. Now, none of those terms would describe the Pharisees. None of those terms would describe the Sadducees. And yet, those terms do describe this group, and I would say every one of those terms also describes the Jesus movement. So when the scrolls were discovered, people were very, very excited and keen, but also a little nervous, because it's like we found an apocalyptic messianic group thinking they're preparing the way in the wilderness, saying they're people of the new covenant, communal living, separatists, baptizing into the group, and so forth. They're doing all of these things, and basically my screen went out. I'm going to put it back. It doesn't matter, but I'd rather not talk to a blank screen, so give me just a second. I need to probably, sorry about that. This is probably going to happen over and over. So anyway, where was I? I was talking about the how people were maybe a bit nervous because they would think, is this like a precursor of the Jesus movement? Or did the Jesus movement kind of copy, or did they come from this group or whatever? But we're not going to talk about that today. So, but it is a good topic to talk about the relationship of the Jesus movement, the John the Baptist movement, followers of James, the brother of Jesus, how they might have related to the Dead Sea Scroll group. I've written a lot about that in my books, such as The Jesus Dynasty. Now, as far as the 40% of the scrolls that do have the Hebrew copies of the Hebrew Bible, there's one book supposedly missing, and it just so happens that it's not missing anymore. Some of you who want to look this up, you could paste the URL maybe in one of the chats on YouTube or Facebook. But just recently, the book of Esther has been identified as fragments of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So if you've ever heard, and you still read this if you look it up, that they had copies of all the books of the Hebrew Bible except for Esther and Nehemiah. Well, Esther has now been located, and it's an article at the website thetorah.com. So if you go to thetorah.com, it's called Newly Deciphered Qumran Scroll Revealed to be Esther. So it's real easy to find. It's by let's see, Rabbi Asher Tov Lev. And it's a really exciting story because you know why they hadn't identified Esther? Because somebody spilt some wine on it. And it was stained and you couldn't make it out. But now through photographic means they've been able to make it out, which is really amazing. So what we want to do today, I'm going to switch on my reading light here where I can see better what I want to do, is I want to take this Dead Sea Scroll Bible and I want to pick 5 different, let's see, is it 5 or 6? 1, 2, 3. Actually, it's 4 different references, but some of them have more than one. I'm going to pick 4 or 5 places. Within here, you see I've got them marked here, where the Hebrew Bible that we have, the Masoretic text, differs from the readings that are in the scrolls, and that's what I want to talk about. Now, here's the problem with that. Many people talk about the Hebrew Bible. I've got a Hebrew Bible right here. This is the standard scholarly edition of the Hebrew Bible. It's called the BHS, Biblia Hebraica Stuttgart, the German. That's where it was put out. It's put in Latin. It's referred to as the BHS. And you can see here on the page, if I put it really close at the bottom, that you've got all of these variant readings. So even though people talk about, I want to go by the Masoretic text, you have to realize even the Masoretic text, the traditional Hebrew text, like some of you use the Koran Bible, Koren, it's a standardized text that's been standardized by the rabbis hundreds of years ago, but there are variants. And many of you probably remember or know Bart Ehrman, who is the New Testament scholar, and he was trained at Princeton. And when he learned as a student that there are all these variants in the New Testament, it really disturbed him because he was raised as a very conservative Christian, and whatever the traditional Byzantine texts of the Greek New Testament said, he just felt it had to be perfect without any kind of mistakes or variants. And then when he began going to graduate school and finding out that there are literally hundreds of variants. Now, what you'll often hear is, well, the Masoretic text, it doesn't have any variants. You know how people count the letters and they do these Bible code things? But all you need is one variant and the whole Bible code is thrown off, right? Because all the letters would then shift even by one letter. And so I'm not too fond of the Bible code concept because I happen to know that the text you're searching is just one of several copies of the Masoretic text. The one that is used in the BHS is the Leningrad Codex. It's the oldest copy of the Hebrew Bible, Masoretic text, as we call it. The traditional text is maybe another way to refer to it. That's complete. There's the Aleppo Codex that's a little bit older, but part of it was destroyed by actually anti-Semites who raided the place and tried to burn the scroll. But fortunately, most of it did survive, and it's on display in Jerusalem. If you've been there and seen that, it's in the scroll, in the Shrine of the Book there in Jerusalem. So anyway, when you talk about the Hebrew Bible, here's what we've got. We've got the Masoretic text, but it does have variations. At the bottom of every page, you can see these other readings of other copies of it because copyists make mistakes and variations creep in over the centuries. We've also got what's called the Septuagint, LXX. You'll see it abbreviated. That's a translation of the Hebrew Bible that we think was made in the 2nd century BCE. And we do have manuscripts of the Septuagint, quite a few that have survived. And it doesn't always read the same as the Hebrew Bible either. So you got other versions. And then the Samaritan Pentateuch. Now that's only the 5 books of Moses, but the Samaritan Pentateuch does differ in places with the Masoretic text. So that would be 3 different versions of the Torah, at least, and of the Hebrew Bible in general. You would have 2 versions, the Masoretic text with its variants, as well as the Septuagint. And of course, the Septuagint would have variants also. And then you add the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is not complete because we don't have absolute copies of every single book of the Hebrew Bible. But it is, in fact, another tradition. And sometimes the readings of the Dead Sea Scrolls agree with the Septuagint. The first or second example we're going to have today, we're going to consider today, actually agrees with the Greek, not the Masoretic text. And so scholars have been busy now for 75 years doing all of these comparisons and trying to figure it out. This bothers some people. I hope it doesn't bother you who are listening. I don't want it to bother you. Tell my students I don't want it to bother them either, because what you don't want to do is trade one fundamentalism for another. I was raised in a fairly, conservative Christian tradition, and the tradition I came out of, the Campbellite or Churches of Christ, they would have said, by and large, although they're probably liberalized a little here and there over the years, but they would have said, the Bible is inspired and it's perfect and it has no mistakes, and they just don't like variations. And yet there are variations. When I first took Greek, I've got my Greek New Testament here. This is the Greek New Testament, and you can see it's very, very similar. It's got all of those variations at the bottom of the Greek text. So we shouldn't wish for something that we don't have. We have different versions of the Hebrew Bible, different versions of the New Testament, actually different versions of every single book from antiquity. This is actually a treasure of riches. We want that sort of thing because we want all the possible information we can. Now, when the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, Cave 1, there were 10 jars and only one had scrolls. And Cave 1, in the jar with the 7 scrolls that were in that jar, was a complete copy of the book of Isaiah. I've got a book over here with the original colored pictures that Trevor did, the scholar Trevor, living in Jerusalem at the Albright. Beautiful pictures that are still used today in color. So everybody wondered, well, if you compared the Isaiah of the Masoretic text, the traditional Hebrew text, with the Dead Sea Scroll copy, because the Leningrad Codex, the oldest copy of the Masoretic text, is about 1000 AD, CE. And the Dead Sea Scroll Isaiah is probably 150, 200 BCE. So you've jumped back over 1,000 years, probably 1,200 years. It's hard to date exactly. But isn't that amazing? So you want to kind of compare it. It is our book of Isaiah. It has the same number of sections and chapters, and it essentially has the same contents. But there are thousands of variations where it reads differently. And sometimes those variations agree with the Septuagint or the Samaritan Pentateuch. Now, usually people will say, well, it was essentially the same. And that's true. And it's also false. But it probably depends on what you mean essentially. It is essentially the same. But essentially the same doesn't mean you shouldn't notice the differences, as I'm going to show you today, because the differences could be significant. And, get ready for this, some of the readings in the Dead Sea Scrolls parallel the Moses Scroll, and Ross Nichols is currently working on a project to compare all the readings of the Dead Sea Scrolls of Deuteronomy. And did you know some of those are Paleo-Hebrew, actually written in the ancient script, with the Moses Scroll transcript that we have? And that's going to be a pretty long project, but he has begun that project. So that's going to be pretty interesting. And I'm going to show you one of those today, one of the parallels, where the Moses Scroll reads the same as one of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is very, very interesting. It sounds like maybe it's not a forgery, because I don't think Moses Shapiro had copies of the Qumran scrolls, at least, that were found in 1947. I would encourage you all to, when you think about, fundamentalism and the Hebrew faith and what it is to follow the God of Israel and so forth, to have an open view that there are pillars of the faith, the call of Abraham, the Torah given at Sinai, the prophets, and so forth, that seem to be bedrock for all forms of Judaism and Hebrew faith, even Gentiles that adhere to the Hebrew faith. But essentially, you don't have to have a set view of what the text has to be if it doesn't conform to what we're discovering or what the facts are. And I think most of the people in these particular audiences of United Israel World Union, which is sponsoring this talk that I'm presenting here, this class, I think most of the people who follow Ross Nichols' teaching week by week, he teaches on this channel every week at the same time. And you're used to this, like you want all the scholarly information possible. And I'm glad that that's the case. It's not a threat. It's a treasure trove of riches to delve into these things. So let's start with Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 12. If you have a Hebrew Bible, whatever translation, doesn't matter because it'll probably be the Masoretic text. Go ahead and turn to Deuteronomy 5, and you will then have the standard version of the traditional Hebrew text. So it's on page 154 in this Dead Sea Scrolls Bible. If you have the book, you can follow along with the book. And it has to do with the 10 words. You know, one of the ways of describing, people say, what is United Israel World Union? It was formed in 1944 by a Jewish correspondent and Bible student. His name was David Horowitz. And David Horowitz coined the idea of Decalogue faith for all nations. And we like that very much. The idea would be the essential faith around the 10 words, the 10 commandments, should be for the whole world, not simply for Jews. And so the Decalogue faith. And as you know, one command of the Decalogue faith is, in fact, the Sabbath, to keep the Sabbath. Today is the Sabbath. So either remember or observe the Sabbath day. So verse 12 does in fact say, observe the Sabbath day, keep it holy, as the Lord commanded you. And it's actually the divine name, YHVH, which they write in Paleo Hebrew, by the way. 6 days you will labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. So forth, you shall do no work. Now, in Deuteronomy, you have this idea that the reason you do this is because God brought the people of Israel out of Egypt. And that's also in Exodus 31 as the reason. But as you know, there's also the idea that God has commanded you to keep the Sabbath. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth and the sea and all that is in them, and rested the seventh day, so that the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. Now, that's not in the Masoretic text at this spot of Deuteronomy. It is in the Moses scroll. So there's the example. In other words, the Dead Sea Scroll copy, it's actually 4Q Deuteronomy, it's called, from Cave 4. It's a fragment of Deuteronomy. It has the idea that the Sabbath goes back to the creation. So it's connecting to Genesis 1 and 2 in the same way that the Moses scroll does. And if you compare Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5, you can see the two versions. So this could be seen as an attempt to harmonize, like, let's give both reasons. But on the other hand, it could also be seen as maybe a tradition that the Dead Sea Scroll group is preserving that would be older than the later tradition that we know as the Masoretic text. So that's the first example I want to give. The second one is a couple of verses. It's in what's called the Song of Moses, and it's Deuteronomy 32. So if you go to Deuteronomy chapter 32, and you can see down at verse 8, a very well-known verse that says, when the Most High separated or gave to the nations their inheritance, he separated humankind, and he set the bounds of the peoples according to the number of the children of Israel. That's the Masoretic text. That's probably what the translation says that most of you are reading, depending on which one you're reading. However, in the Dead Sea Scroll portion, it says, according to the sons of Elohim, the children of God, and it uses Elohim. Isn't that interesting? Because Elohim is also used in the Moses scroll, as you know. Many of you know who've read about it or read the book. So the sons of Elohim. Now, the sons of Elohim could be considered the children of Israel, I suppose, but because of another verse in this same chapter, or in the same song, if you go down to verse 43, it's pretty clear that it's talking about the sons of God, or the B'nai Elohim, as it is in Hebrew, that are the hosts that surround God. Psalm 82. Remember, it talks about how God sits and is surrounded by all of these gods, or Elohim. So here's what verse 43 says in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and this would be 4Q Deuteronomy also, K4, the copy of Deuteronomy. It reads like this. This is going to be different from what you have if you have the Masoretic text. Rejoice, O heavens, together with him, and bow down to him, all you gods, for he will avenge the blood of his sons, his children, his banim, and will render vengeance to his enemies, and will recompense those who hate him, and will atone for the land of his people. And so it's actually talking about bow down to him, you gods, this reference to you gods. Or in the Septuagint even has sons of God, which seems again to be these ruling powers that are spoken of a number of times in the Hebrew Bible. I think I have this book handy. Let's see if I do have it handy. I recommend it. This includes the New Testament too, but the part on the Hebrew Bible is really good. Michael Heiser's book, The Unseen Realm. Michael has an article online, you can look it up, called The B'nai Elohim, the Sons of God. It's really good. He did his dissertation on that subject, and he's a real expert on it. It's something to really study. So here you have a text in the Dead Sea Scrolls that is talking about the B'nai Elohim as seemingly parallel to Psalm 82, meaning these heavenly beings, not simply talking about the flesh and blood Israelites. So I think that's pretty interesting as we go along. Now, Isaiah 53. Isaiah 53 is really, really interesting. It was in Cave 1 in that jar that had the 7 scrolls, and it's a complete copy of Isaiah. I actually am going to pull out my copy here to show you. Because it's so beautiful, I want you to see, and I think this is the color one. Yep, this is the color one. So you can buy this. These are the photographs that Trevor originally made. You've got the black and white and the color. Absolutely gorgeous photographs. If you've been to Israel and been to the Shrine of the Book, there's a replica of this scroll wrapped around the central scroll display area where you can see it almost like it's wrapped around like a Torah scroll. And Israelis have fun taking their kids to see the Dead Sea Scrolls because any kid in Israel can just read Isaiah right off the page, even though it's in this Herodian script. So it's pretty amazing how things have not changed. However, does Isaiah have changes? Often, I remember when I first studied this, I was in a more conservative school, Abilene Christian University, and there was more an emphasis on, it's basically the same as the Masoretic text. And it is. It's basically the same as the Masoretic text, and it's quite remarkable that Isaiah is preserved to that degree. However, it does have interesting readings that are different. A few of them are pretty minor, but I'm going to mention a few of them, but some of them are quite strikingly different. So Isaiah 53, which is the famous suffering servant hymn of Isaiah, one of the 4 suffering servant hymns, as they're traditionally known by scholars, Hebrew Bible scholars. And I'm going to read verse 3. He was despised and rejected by others, and I'm reading the Dead Sea version, and a man of sorrows, and familiar with suffering, and like one from whom people hide their faces, and we despised him and did not value him. So the footnote explains that he was despised is the Masoretic text. Remember, he was despised and rejected. Many people have that memorized. Notice this says, we despised him. And so in the Dead Sea Scroll version of Isaiah, it's in the first person. That we, and that would go with verse 4. Surely he has borne our sufferings and so forth. If you go on down to, verse 8, in the middle of just the last part of verse 8, for he was cut off from the land of the living, he was stricken for the transgression of my people, and it's actually his people. Instead of me, it's amo, his people, in the Dead Sea version. Does that make a difference? Does that make a difference? Well, you can write it down and study it and think about it. You have to read the whole chapter and think about it. But this is a version that has some parallels. And remember, some of these are also, these readings that we're going over today, are also paralleled in the Septuagint, the Greek translation, meaning that the Greek translators were also using a copy of the Hebrew Bible that would be closer to what we have in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Verse 9 says, and they made his grave with the wicked. I believe the Masoretic text has he made, doesn't it? Let's see. He made, maybe? Yeah. They made, so it's plural. They made his grave with the wicked, and with rich people his tomb. And if you remember, the Masoretic text has this strange plural with a rich man in his deaths, plural. And some people have really gotten off on that and try to apply it to Jesus and say, well, maybe he survived the cross and then died later, so he has deaths, not death, and all kinds of ideas people have come up with. But this just says, with rich people was his tomb. In other words, he was buried in a tomb, or this person's buried in a tomb. I'm not talking about Jesus here. Although he had done no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth. Yet the Lord, and this is Yod-He Vav-He, Hashem, but the Lord was willing to crush him, and he made him suffer. So I think, let's see, he made him suffer, MT, right. I'm not sure that, I don't have the MT open, so I'm not sure that's not so significant for us right now. Now here's the one I think is most interesting, verse 11. You ready? Verse 11. When I first studied the Dead Sea Scrolls, I did a number of interviews. I remember Zola Levitt. Any of you remember Zola Levitt? Had that very popular TV program. He was very excited about this reading of the scroll because in the Dead Sea copy of the scrolls, it says, out of his suffering, his soul will see light. Out of his suffering, his soul will see light and find satisfaction. The idea of his soul seeing light is not in the Masoretic text. There's nothing like that. It just says he will see the suffering of his soul. But to see light, or, is very, very different. It's very clear in the scrolls. What that would mean, it was interpreted probably by Second Temple groups that might have used a text like this to maybe mean resurrection, because toward the end it talks about him seeing his offspring and rejoicing and so forth and dividing the spoil. And so you could see how the Dead Sea Scroll group would think that their teacher, who they felt fulfilled this, the teacher of righteousness they called him, he was their leader, and they saw him as a kind of a new Moses, but they would feel that basically that this person maybe is going to suffer and be buried, but also see light And I cover that in my lecture, Dead Messiahs Who Don't Return, because they expected him to return and he simply didn't. There's some other things. This book is nice because whenever there's a difference, it puts it in italics, and otherwise it's the Masoretic text. So it's really easy to use, and then you look down in the footnote and you see what the Masoretic text had, what the Septuagint had, and what the Samaritan Pentateuch had. So Isaiah 53 is interesting. There's some differences that might be significant. Finally, and I think this one is really, really interesting, Malachi, the last of the Hebrew prophets. The famous passage in chapter 3 that is quoted in the New Testament and applied to John the Baptizer. I call him the Baptizer, Yochanan Hamat-Vil, John the Dipper. I'll read it to you in the scroll version. You ready? Therefore, behold, I send my messenger, and he will prepare the way before me, and they will suddenly come to his temple, the Lord whom you seek, and the messenger of the covenant whom you desire. Behold, he himself comes, says Hashem of hosts, the Lord of hosts, the eternal of hosts. But who can endure them? They come, meaning when they come is the idea. Now, did you notice any difference in what you probably have, the Masoretic text? It looks like it's two figures, two messiahs. The Lord here is not the divine name. When the Lord comes to his temple, that's Adon, L-O-R-D, the Lord, the master, the Adon of the earth, so to speak. Could be a Messiah figure. So let me read it again. Therefore, I will send my messenger, that's one figure. He will prepare the way before me, and they will suddenly come to his temple, the Lord whom you seek, and the messenger of the covenant. This group believed in two messiahs. They believed in a priestly Messiah, this Dead Sea Scroll group, and a Davidic Messiah. So they believed that both messiahs were coming. And here you see, two are talked about in the Dead Sea Scroll version of Malachi. And then, excuse me, let me get a little drink of water. Who can endure them when they come? Who can endure them when they come? Which is original. I'm just tempted to think that the plural is the more original because we have texts like Zechariah 6 that talks about the two messiahs. Earlier in Zechariah with the two olive branches and the lampstand, they're the two sons of fresh oil, one on the right and one on the left. And in Zechariah 6, you talk about the Davidic figure, the branch, sitting on his throne, and then a priest standing by his side. So when you read the Dead Sea Scrolls, they believe in the coming of two messiahs. They talk about the coming of the messiahs of Israel and Aaron. Israel would be the Messiah of Israel, the Davidic ruler, the king, and the Messiah of Aaron would be the priest. So the Dead Sea Scroll group had three figures. I've written a lot about this. I've got articles about it. I've got an article on my blog called 1, 2, 3 Messiahs, ? So you can look that up, jamestabor.com, if you want to read more about that. But I'm thinking during the Second Temple period, there were expectations for three figures. If you go by the scrolls, here are the figures. A prophet like Moses, a kind of second Moses who would come, sort of middle figure. That would be the lampstand figure, who's the Adon of the whole earth, the Lord of the whole earth. And he's able to inaugurate the new covenant. That was their view. And they believed that he had come, the teacher of righteousness. They say things about him that are quite extravagant. For the example, they say, to him, God has made known all the mysteries of the prophets. All the mysteries of the prophets. Amazing. And we have books like the Habakkuk Pesher, that was also Cave 1, in that one jar, one of the 7 scrolls that was found. It's in the translation. You can read it, and it takes the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible book of Habakkuk and then interprets it verse by verse, but it sees it in the light of the history of the group, the Dead Sea Scroll group, so that they actually apply it to their teacher. So the lecture I gave, or the YouTube video I gave, was a bar lecture, Biblical Archaeology Society lecture. Dead Messiahs Who Don't Return goes into that in great detail, so you can listen to that to get more details. But I'm thinking that essentially they're waiting. They have him, and then they're waiting for the two messiahs. But I don't see any evidence in any of the scrolls that the two messiahs ever showed up. And what happens is the teacher's killed, and on Yom Kippur, the priest, the wicked, he's called the wicked priest because he's the priest they think is illegitimate. The priest in Jerusalem, probably one of the high priests that we know about. Depending on when you date the scrolls, it could go anywhere from the Maccabean period down to even into the first century. I tend to think the teacher thrived in the first century BC, but we have priests all the way through that period that are serving in the temple, and Josephus preserves their names. We have all the names of these priests during this period. Well, this group considers one of them a wicked priest, and he comes down on Yom Kippur. Now, here's a question. How could he travel on Yom Kippur to the desert community at Qumran? I'm assuming for now that Qumran is where the group was and where the teacher was, and some people would say there's no absolute evidence for that, but I think it's a good possibility. How would he come on Yom Kippur? Isn't the high priest in Jerusalem supposed to go into the temple on Yom Kippur? So he couldn't be traveling down and persecuting this teacher of Qumran unless they're using a different calendar. And they are. Constantly on the scrolls, it says over and over again that, I'm looking at my text messages. Okay, sorry. Getting buzzed, but it's not, it's just this, that, and the other. Constantly, you read about the idea of the calendar being different and the days, months, seasons, and years being different because they're using a solar calendar. And it's a beautiful calendar. It's a very interesting calendar. If you take a look at my YouTube lecture on my YouTube channel, it's called the Essene Calendar Made Simple. Believe it or not, you can make it simple, and you can even put it on a single page. I've got somewhere a page. I don't know if I have it right here, but I'm going to put it up on my blog with that lecture where you can see what kind of calendar they had. As far as I know, these two messiahs, though, didn't come. So the wicked priest, as he's called, came down and persecuted the teacher. It's possible the teacher was killed. We're not absolutely sure about that. And then the group decides that the end will come, because remember, it's an apocalyptic group. They think they're going to live to see the end, just like the followers of Jesus. And it didn't come, and they say it's going to come in about 40 years. And then when 40 years pass, they, instead of losing their faith, they talk about God has prolonged the seasons, has prolonged the time. Very similar to the kind of thing you find, say, in Peter, I think, isn't it? 2 Peter. God's long suffering, he doesn't always do things according to what people thought. And they also conclude that all the times predicted by the book of Daniel have been fulfilled, but the end didn't come. Therefore, not that we're wrong, but, that our interpretation's wrong, that they weren't fulfilled, because they haven't been fulfilled. They believe that God is giving more grace, more time, and it's going to be longer. And even though the date was right, God decided not to send the wrath and the judgment and the end of the age on time, which would have been 40 years after the death of the teacher. How did they come up with that 40 years? They believe there's a final cycle of 10 jubilees, 49-year jubilees, 490 years. They interpret Daniel 9, the so-called 70 weeks prophecy, and they've placed their teacher in the 10th week, and then they began to talk about in the final 49-year period, everything will come, and then it didn't come. It didn't happen. And so they're basically disappointed. And they decide that God has decided to prolong the days. How long did the movement last? It's hard to know, but given this flexibility with the text of Habakkuk, I think we could presume that they went into the first century. I would think some of the followers of John the Baptist and Jesus might have had grandparents and parents that had known the teacher and maybe were kind of part of that general Messianic movement. Eisenman calls it the Messianic movement of Palestine. He uses the term Palestine, which the scholars use to describe the Holy Land, but the Messianic movement of the land of Israel. And I would say that there are probably remnants of that, because if you look at the Jesus movement, there's just as I mentioned, a lot of parallels. Not only the apocalyptic wilderness, new covenant kind of thing, but also the idea of sacred meals, of bread and wine that you couldn't partake of. It's called the pure meal of the saints, the sanctified ones. They're very separationist in terms of their piety and their idea. They have a council of 12 and an inner council of 3. Does that remind you of anything? And yet, the Jesus movement is very, very different from what you read in the scrolls in terms of interpreting the Torah. The best example, and this lecture is not on that, but I want to kind of close with this where you get a feeling of what they're all about. In the scrolls, it says that if a beast or animal falls into a pit on the Sabbath, you must not help the animal out because it's the Sabbath. And there's a command in the Sabbath that you stay in your dwelling. And they took that very literally. Literally, you don't leave the camp. By the way, latrines, they don't even go outside the camp on the Sabbath to go to the toilet. Josephus mentions that about the Essenes. He presents it as something admirable. Like, wow, they're so dedicated. They go for 24 hours without going to the toilet. And some of you know that Josias and I, a few years ago, we think we discovered the latrines at Qumran, exactly as the scrolls describe, northwest of the camp, 1,000 cubits to 2,000 cubits away from the camp, hidden from view, is the area where we did soil samples, and we think we located their latrines. There's a cemetery nearby with over 1,100 graves, mostly male, and there's some dispute about the female because there are a few women, and they haven't all been excavated, just a sample. But Zayas thinks that the women are later burials of Bedouin women that just took advantage of a local cemetery. They're not ancient. But by far, most of them are men, and therefore possibly Qumran is a celibate community. So you do get these parallels, but you also get differences. Jesus says, I think it's in Luke, which of you would not take a beast out of a pit on the Sabbath, as if to say anybody would do that. And believe me, you know, this picking grain on the Sabbath story that's in Mark chapter 2 and Matthew chapter 12, where the disciples pick grain, the scrolls specifically say that you must prepare your meals before the Sabbath. That's in the Torah, right? So that's considered, you didn't prepare that before the Sabbath. Also, it's threshing or harvesting, which is forbidden on the Sabbath. So the scroll people back in the days of the teacher, in the time when these things were written, the sectarian scrolls, they would just be appalled that the disciples of Jesus are harvesting barley and popping the grain in their mouth when they're famished. And if you remember, the response of Jesus was not like, oh, well, sorry, we broke the law, but it was basically like, well, you know, the Sabbath's made for people, not people for the Sabbath. So the idea of being humane to an animal or taking care of human need on the Sabbath, which the Pharisees also taught, and they made certain allowances to allow you to keep the Sabbath in less of a strict way, whereas the Karaites later did not. And I'd have to check with Nehemiah Gordon to see today how they're defining the dwelling. Because if you can't go out of your house during the Sabbath, your dwelling, does that mean your literal house you live in, like the rooms you inhabit or apartment? Or does it mean your town? Or does it mean your city if you're in a large city? All these things are interpreted differently by Judaism over the years. Some of you might know there is around the city of Jerusalem today a wire or thread-like element up on poles all the way around the city, and that the rabbis define Jerusalem as the dwelling of the people in Jerusalem. So you don't go out of your dwelling, meaning you don't go out of the city of Jerusalem, but you can go anywhere in the city of Jerusalem. This group would have been horrified at any of those kinds of interpretations. I think they would have been very upset with Jesus for any number of things that he did. So I don't think Jesus is part of this. Some people think John the Baptist is, and they try to make him really rigid and conservative. But, you know, the only traditions we have of John the Baptist, he's actually pretty accommodating. He talks to Roman soldiers. He talks to tax collectors and blesses them and says, you're fine, you can come in the movement. Of course, everybody has to repent, but I mean, he seems like he's more accepting. I would put John the Baptist, Jesus, and James sort of on a plane, even though they might have had some differences. So this isn't a lecture on the Jesus movement, but because it's another parallel Second Temple apocalyptic movement of the time, I want to mention it. So they're both movements, the Jesus movement and the Dead Sea Scroll movement, they're reading these texts, and we have to wonder what version. We know the Qumran group was reading the version that we just studied, but is there evidence that in the New Testament that some of the texts that were being quoted were actually, they're quoting more the Septuagint or the Dead Sea Scrolls? And the answer is yes. That's why some of the readings differ quite a bit, because they're quoting a different version. They're not just changing the Bible. They're using, I guess you could say, a different text of that particular book of the Bible. So I hope that has been interesting to you. You'll get the Dead Sea Scroll Bible, delve into it. I'm particularly excited about what Ross will be able to uncover in looking at all the scrolls of Deuteronomy from the Dead Sea collection and comparing them to the Shapira scroll. And as I said earlier, that could be quite telling, because Shapira would not have known these versions of Deuteronomy in Hebrew if there are parallels, and we've already seen a couple. Then how would he have forged the document and made up readings that are later going to be discovered in 1947 in caves? But remember, he found the Moses scroll in a cave wrapped in linen with the sticky residue around it. It sounds kind of like the discovery of the Qumran scrolls. So some of you are going on the trip with us in October, and we'll do other trips as well in the future if you can't make this one. But one of the things we're going to do is stay in the desert for, 3 nights, I think. And we're going to visit Qumran, and we're going to visit Masada, and we're going to walk around these caves, and it's going to be very exciting. Dead Sea Scroll news breaks all the time, like that Esther scroll discovery that I just told you about. During the time I've been teaching my Dead Sea Scroll class this semester, we've had several major news stories on the Dead Sea Scrolls break. So it's really an exciting field to be in. I'm really, really interested and fascinated with the Dead Sea Scrolls. I've studied them for years, and I hope this will encourage all of you to study them too. So, Shabbat Shalom, and wish you all well.
Okay.
Wow, that was amazing.
I hope you enjoyed that. Obviously the tour that Dr. Tabor was going to go on, it will be in March. There was an October one, but he's doing the March 2023 from the 17th through the 18th. And you can sign up at blossomingrose.org. Really a very, very interesting, and hopefully you can make it. If not, just the idea of what the Dead Sea Scrolls are as a data point, and all that we try to do, we're trying to find the truth in all these matters, and who's had their hand in it and who hasn't had their hand in it, and why. We're going to say something,
Well, I
Patty?
just love the connection to the Moses scroll. There is no mention of animal sacrifices in the Moses scroll, and I like to think that the bones that they did find at Qumran were bones of animals that they had consumed, and that they didn't offer animal sacrifices, but rather that they offered prayers and praise as their sacrifice. And
Yeah.
I guess that's another discussion there, but that's a good connection
Yeah.
that I found there.
Well, we're going to be leaving here shortly, but we have some pictures of Israel that we were going to throw up to kind of entice you, because your whole view of the thing changes when you get there. First of all, what stunned me was how small Israel is, and then also how beautiful it is. This is a picture that Patty took outside of Tamar, and with blossoming roses. What a beautiful place to go down there. And it's, everyone wants to go to Jerusalem and all that, but there's these other beautiful places that is there. And there's Patty with the previous dog,
Namir.
He's gone on top of Prayer Mountain. That's a beautiful thing. When you see something like the Dome of the Rock, it does change you. I mean, and this is us standing before it, and where World War III could be revolving around this one place. This is the Hinnom Valley, and it just shows you there's Mount Zion right there.
And James will be taking me.
He'll take you to all these places.
Sites. You can see them all in person.
There's our shack in Tamar.
No, it's the hut. It's
the hut.
Shack.
It's a beautiful place. And again, this is the kind of stuff you see. You go down these streets and you realize you're not in America or you're London or it's an ancient city, and you get the feeling of those things. There's the beauty of it also. Here we see Tel Aviv, and we're standing out there. This is in Tamar, the place where the Israeli and American flags fly, and where in World War II the English stayed and fought for this ground. Really good
Libby
stuff.
Bond says, we loved our time in Israel in 2019. And Libby, this is a tour also for people who have already been to Israel. There are more things that James is going to be revealing in this tour. So maybe you'll join everyone.
Here was Patty was by the Temple Mount, and we were struck by some divine intervention. No, I'm only kidding about that. Just a beautiful place. This, of course, is Har Karkum, a possible place for Mount Sinai or Horeb. And I'm just going through these. You can take all your own. Getting there is not. This is Egypt right against us. In the Israeli IDF, they escorted us to this place. So these are the kind of things. Here's a United Israel working with the Zionist group. And you can see Dr. Tabor, me, Patty, Elon Pomerantz, and Ross Nichols trying to talk about what United Israel is and what good it does. Here's the National Synagogue in Israel, and it is a beautiful place where they hold services every Shabbat. Of course, there's our friend Joke of the Crocs. He's a beautiful dog that likes us, and we have to keep bringing him home because he won't go home. This here is Arad, and again, there was the attacks on during the Exodus from Arad. Again, I'm going through this quickly, and this shows you the smelting place, which is right outside of Tamar, the copper smelting place. It's here, and you can go pick up pieces of the slag. Those crocodiles. Ross talked about this. Just joke about it's in a prophecy that there was dragons. This is right across from Tamar, and this man Ofer saves Nile crocodiles. He's an amazing guy.
Sylvia Halpert says it was a very moving experience being in the desert at biblical Tamar Park, Blossoming Rose.
Yeah.
Yes, it's a mystical place, and I hope some of you or all of you get the chance to go there.
Here is the Scorpions Ascent, and that's Ron Vanderham, my good friend. We walked up there, and boy, does that take a few steps. And it's a crazy place. We can tell you some stories about that. There's Patty with an ibex.
Yes, I always manage to make friends when I go to Israel.
And that's how close it was. Amazing how close we got to the ibex. This is on the way to Har Karkum, and that's the Land Rover. And we're in the middle of nowhere. It's scary.
We actually had to park the Land Rover and walk.
Here is what could be part of the Israelite
Encampment. Maybe they
encampment.
had made an altar or stones to dedication to the
There's
12
There's 12 stones on it.
stones there. Yes.
Yeah, and that's the amazing part. Here is around Qumran, where some of the additional caves are, and just to give you an idea what it looks like. And there is Shiloh, and the point is that Shiloh is the ark was there longer than it's been anywhere else at Shiloh, and you should go there, and it's a very gorgeous sight. This is where Samuel comes at the end. Remember, his mother Hannah comes to the chief priest and says, "Hey, if you give me a child, I'll dedicate him to the Almighty." And then, of course, that is Samuel. And the one thing you'll learn there, Samuel was kind of the first evangelical preacher. He saw as Shiloh was being taken away, he went out to the tribes and said, "Hey, what about this deal we had with God?" It's kind of really amazing. There's Jodel and some of our other friends standing on there. We went there with Jodel, and it was really a great time to talk about these things and have the time. I think the one thing I'll say about the trips is you have time to talk to people and meet them and just have discourse. And we don't all agree on everything, but we can all talk about it. And then I would like to end with this picture. When you stand there and see this for the first time,
It's quite a view.
it's something.
Now, is it standing on the Mount of Olives?
Yeah, it's standing on the Mount of Olives,
yes,
looking
yes.
towards this view.
It's breathtaking. It'll take your breath away.
And I just suggest that if you can, you please come and join Dr. Tabor. Ross is going to have another tour. Ross isn't going to be with Dr. Tabor on this tour, but he'll have his own tour. And like I say, when you have an expert like James and you can really talk about it and not be painted into one or
another.
Jodel
says, "Oh no, not that pic." Don't we all love having our pictures just appear like that?
No, it was really great to have Jodel there and her friends and have these deep discussions about the Torah, whether we're right or wrong. You learn.
And Sylvia Halpert says here, should we build a new tabernacle at Shiloh?
Yeah.
I don't know. The time may be coming, Sylvia.
It could be.
We don't know.
It could be.
We don't know. But anyway, next week, Ross will be back, and he's going to be starting this Jeremiah series, which I am so excited about. And I know he's going to be glad to be home, and I know y'all miss him. But we want to thank you for joining us and sharing these last few Shabbats with us.
Yeah, Shabbat Shalom, everyone. And
Shabbat Shalom, and thank you. And don't forget, if you can't register, if you're looking for information on how to register for the tour, please contact us.
The other thing is the 80th. Don't forget that. It's next
the
April. And also we're going to kind of revisit the Restoring Abrahamic Faith by Dr. Tabor. He's been working on it, and we'll come up with an update because a lot of people asked about
that. By the way, Jodel, I think you look great in that pic, by the way.
Yeah. Jodel always looks great.
I know she does.
Shabbat Shalom, everyone.
Bye-bye, everyone. Thank you. Shabbat Shalom.